Great. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Amiri, and thank you, Sarah, so much for joining me today. Those of you who are watching this on Facebook, thank you for joining us as well. My name's Atif Choudhury from DNA, Diversity and Ability, and I'm one of the founders of the organization. And before we begin as well, do comment on the Facebook page where you can, what brought you to the session, what excites you about the conversation we're having today, even what angers you, what do you think that needs to go further? Are we being progressive enough? I don't mean that as just the three of us as talking here, but what do you feel is really the challenges that await a generation of that perhaps deserve a lot more that aren't yet born? There's lots to consider there. But before we go into the depths of that, I wanted to take this moment to introduce you to Sarah Hughes, who's really become a new friend of mine and someone I'm really excited to get to know more, and to Amri Johnson, who I have the privilege of working with and speaking to once a month. So before I begin, Sarah, would you like to say a few words about Sarah?
Sure. I'm Sarah and I'm the Chief Exec at the Centre for Mental Health. And you may see that I'm drinking a very strong coffee out of a mug that says Fierce Female. So that's what you can expect this afternoon from me. I'll try not to be too fierce. Can't promise anything.
Oh, please. Thanks. Amiri.
My name's Amri Johnson. I am a executive advisor in the space of inclusion and diversity. I'm based in Basel, Switzerland, so I'm an American living in the German-speaking part of Switzerland rather than an Englishman in New York. I flipped it a little bit, and so I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to be with these two giants in the work that we do, and I'm not saying that lightly. And you're in for a fierce sister and a fierce brother in conversation with a brother that's trying to learn as much as he can. It's great to be here.
Oh, that's really profound. I feel that at many levels. So both of you, I guess I wanted to go through some questions and just to ask you for questions as we go through, but also just to sort of take a moment, I know, to sort of acknowledge where we're at with the world at the moment and the depths of so much pain that's been felt across. And it's not easy stuff. What we're about to talk about is traumatic, for so many people who can't necessarily voice their feelings or emotions or articulate them even to themselves easily, let alone to speak on social media as the way we are able to. So I want to just take stock of that for a moment and just maybe just give some solidarity to those voices that are really struggling in that space. But also to sort of recognize as well that what we've seen, and I guess we'll come out on these questions, but what we have seen in the year that we've had since George Floyd's death, his murder, and what that's provoked around the world and what it's unlocked, it's not easy stuff. It is just not easy stuff. And I touched on this on a writing that the DNA team talked about last year and wrote for everyone to say, look, these moments are changing us and they're changing all of us, but these moments are not truly moments. They are things that have gone on for 400 years. They have been endured countlessly in places that and voices and in realities that we are never going to see or hear from truly. So with that comes a lot of injustice and with that comes the urgency of what solidarity can look like and deserves to look like. So I suppose I'm going to start with that context in my first question, which is really in the context of Black Lives Matters and the year that we've had. And I'm really conscious that this isn't a year of Black Lives Matters. Black Lives Matters as a concept, as a challenge, is much older than that, and really sparked from George Zimmerman's murder, the murder that he had inflicted. But I want to ask this moment is, what do you think has changed in the conversations in this year around social justice? What do you feel, the two of you, what do you think has been the big change, if at all? First, I want to ask that question to Sarah, if I may.
Thank you. And I've been thinking about it deeply for the last 25 years, I think, in terms of, what changes every day in terms of inclusion and social justice. I think before I speak, I do want to send my heartfelt solidarity to the Floyd family and all of the families of people who've been lost to racism for generations, for centuries, as you've rightly said. And I think that, you know, when we talk about what's changed in the last year, I think we have to acknowledge that the pandemic, the gross indecency of the murder of George Floyd, the absolute shocking nature of it was almost like an electric shock globally. And that's, as you say, building on decades of thinking about this. Black Lives Matter wasn't a new organization by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think that what's changed has been the use of language. You know, so we have a kind of literacy around the language of social justice, I think, in a way that we hadn't before, actually. So there's a kind of tangible shift around the language of privilege, you know. So again, these are new ideas to many, many people. And so that has really been quite a powerful you know, kind of shift to observe. You know, the vocabulary around these things is shifting. I was thinking about, you know, where are these conversations happening? So, you know, they're happening in commercial environments, they're happening in charities, they're happening in schools, friendships groups, in a much more tangible way. So I can't go on my social media for sure, and bearing in mind I cultivate it so I'm not subjected to, you know, idiots.
Yeah.
But you know that I have a cultivated social media, but that the language is quite sophisticated, the conversations are far reaching. But when we're talking about tangible change, that's an entirely different question. So I think, you know, in terms of impact, I think we could come back to that, because I'm not too sure the impact in terms of the change we want to see in people's experiences have moved. So if you were to ask one of our young people today, you know, are you experiencing racism less? I'm not convinced they would say yes.
Sure.
But I think that they might be part of many more conversations, and I don't know whether that's a stage we go through, or whether that's progress. And I'm, you know, sitting here today after observing, you know, racism in sport over the last week, and thinking, is just using better language good enough?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, absolutely, no, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would like to invite you to talk more about that in terms of the realities that you're facing, really, with the sports issue as we go through this next over the next half an hour. Amri, as well, same for you. If I may ask, if just to remind you, what do you feel is really over the last year of Black Lives Matters? You know, the particular the resistance, the protests, the international outrage.
Yeah.
What do you feel has changed, if at all?
You know, it's so this kind of convergence of a global pandemic and you know, the fact that COVID was so, you know, it reinforced the dehumanization that Black and brown communities had been experiencing for a very long time, that we knew in the healthcare space. I'm an epidemiologist by training, so that was how I got into this work, was around health disparities, health equity. And so when we saw that in COVID, you know, some people were shocked. Those of us that have been around it, we're like, well, yeah, like, really, we're now just talking about this? Like, come on. And at the same time, we were like, okay, we're actually having a conversation about it. The data is available to everyone. Not everybody's necessarily going to care, but those that didn't have the same level of awareness do now. And I think the same thing happened after the murder of George Floyd, and the fact that it wasn't just one murder. There were 3 events that were kind of a apex from multiple events that happened years before, when Black Lives Matter was coined as a hashtag. So I think I'm heartened that there's been more conversations. I'll just tell a quick story. My family, I live here in Switzerland. I have 2 stepkids who are Swiss. My wife is Spanish. She speaks everything with a French accent, but she's Spanish. She speaks everything, but she's Spanish. And, you know, I have a 2-year-old who's obviously mixed culture, mixed race, living as an American, technically similar to his father, but he's going to be way more Swiss than he is American. And they said, hey, they're having a protest here in Basel and we want to go. Now, the epidemiologist in me was like, oh, that's crazy. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. We're not doing that. the black man in me was like, you know what? You know how many black men I've seen killed, and you think a protest is going to happen? I never went to protests in the US because I was tired. I was like, I'm not going to do this. I'm just not bringing myself to it. I'll do my work and I'll build equity in our communities, and I'll do my work inside of corporations, and I'll do my job in the company I was working with in at the before I came here. That's my work. So, but I never would go to protests ever. But we went, and right there, I said, this is a window that we just haven't had before. It was almost like an Emmett Till moment in the US in 1955. You know, Emmett Till followed Brown versus the Board of Education, which I'm from Topeka, Kansas, so that means a lot to me, right? So all that coming together was like a wow moment for me, and a wow moment for the world. And because it happened across the globe, we had to face the dynamics of racism in our respective countries. You know, racism didn't start in the US. Race, the idea, didn't start in the US, but yet that's where most people think it lies, and that's where it ends and begins. But this conversation elevated it to say, you know, dynamics around global racism have been in play, they're still in play, they're in play everywhere, and you have to face them in all their various forms, and the dehumanization that couples that with them with that. And I'll go with what Sarah said. We've had the dialogue, and I think that's really a first entry for this. And the dialogue is really the beginning, and we all know that. But at the same time, you know, after talking about it for a year or two, some people are tired. And now Black and brown people are like, oh, now you see how tiring it is.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting conversation. Like, people are getting a little fatigued around it, but that is a reflection of understanding how fatiguing it is and why it has to be transformed.
There is nothing worse though than people saying, you know, when there, for a long time I was that person in meetings that always said, but what about equality? What about equality? And you know, you could always see the faces around the table kind of going, oh, here she goes again, you know, kind of. And I held that badge with great pride. And I think, but what's really interesting now is to take that point about fatigue. And this is what worries me, which is why the discourse around incidents are very important, is that you will have people in meetings, you know, really important meetings, say things like, we can't be consumed with this agenda. I don't know, what other agenda is there? I don't know what certainly in civil society, that response really surprises me, you know, that we haven't either got the space, the emotional bandwidth, or it's not a priority. So all of those things I find really interesting as a response to trying to face the complexity and pain that you described at the beginning, Atif, which is, you know, our brothers and sisters around the world have been carrying for hundreds of years. And so I particularly find that rage inducing, and worry that narrative, which we see at the most senior government level, you know, we won't mention it, but we will mention the Sewell report, you know, that kind of sort of bandwidth feels like it's getting smaller and smaller all the time. And that concerns me greatly.
I would say, yeah, I mean, I guess from my experience is everything you both of you said is absolutely spot on. I mean, the conversation, this is the challenge, isn't it? The conversation to have, you know, and the fatigue that people, must be amazing to be able to be saying, I'm tired of the conversation, because you don't have to experience it. It must be wonderful. I can't imagine. I'm sort of reminded of two dear friends of mine. So when my son, when last year, when the protests were happening for George Floyd, my son was 8 years old. He is active on talking about climate change, and he's even stood in front of 400 people to do that. But he came to realize that this wasn't about climate change. And I came to realize that I wasn't sure how to talk to give him the answer he needs, which I said, no, it's not. And so he asked, what is it about? And I struggled, and I had to take a deep breath. My son is a mixed heritage, you know, his mother's Lithuanian. And I know at his age, I was already aware our windows were being smashed in by neighbors, you know, of a kind. So there wasn't a reality check that I needed from parents to know what was happening, you know. When my parents sat me down and said, you must do more, it wasn't, I didn't have to ask why I must do more. It was clear when it came to studies to learn, we must do more. So for my son, I'm glad that's a mystery. I'm deeply indebted to the wonder of what that mystery could look like for him. And so I asked two friends, English friends who are close to me, and their politics is strong, good. And I asked them what their sons are the same age. Said, what have you brought up the conversation around Black Lives Matters and the protest? So, and both said to me, no, crikey, no, they're not ready for that yet. And with that came a sense of anger. And I thought, yeah, you know what, you guys, of course they're not ready. But my son, he's the same age as yours. He's not ready either.
Doesn't have a choice.
He's not ready at 8. He's not going to be ready at 30. When is he possibly going to be ready to know that in the eyes of some police and some legal structures, he's not equal? When could he possibly be ready to hear that information? So I guess the conversation, and I suppose on a wider thing that gives me hope, and I think I will touch on this, is at 47 years old, I have never known a time where we're able, and a year is a clumsy period. A year is a clumsy number to give something, to measure, but humans rationalize things in such ways. But I've never known a time where we've been able to talk about structures. I've never known that. I have known a time where we talk about good people, bad people. We've never, and whether they're good or bad people, we don't have to discuss power or powerlessness about what do we do. Now we are talking about structures and what that means in the context of anti-racism. And that gives me hope. It says this conversation has punched hard this year, and our responsibility is to keep punching it hard, relentlessly about those structures, rather than, I guess, good or bad people.
I think that's a really important point that I feel like that's true, that in the last year, it's that language around institutional, systemic, what that actually means, and just the notion of privilege, being able to describe, what that really looks like. And yes, it's painful to acknowledge. And I am of mixed heritage, but I'm white passing. And I have to say that's been a really difficult thing for me to come to terms with in my life. But that's, in relation to people of color, that's, it pales literally in significance. But the idea of privilege is about the fact that you don't have to worry, you don't have to second guess. So when my white friends in where I live, which is a largely rural area, say, I don't think that was racist, or I don't think that was racist, and I'm like, you could, of course you don't, because you couldn't possibly know. So all I'm asking you to do is either believe me, because I do know a bit more than you do, because of my experience of diversity, or just believe the person who said it. Yes. So if a child in the school, because we have very few children of color, but if that child of color says, I experienced this, that's the beginning and end of it. We're not asking you to justify global racism. We're asking you to believe that child.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the framing of the conversation has been one that you can't deny that some of these things exist. And if you do, it's because it's hard to face the fact that this level of dehumanization has been going on for so long, and you don't want to have any part of it. And so if you believe that you've been a part of the dehumanization, you can, if it's framed as you being racist or you having privilege and you taking advantage of that privilege, there are some people in majority groups, white people, that would say, that wasn't me. And I'm not, and my answer is, I'm not blaming you, but I am saying, even in my own community, if we think about the various levels of racism, from structural and interpersonal and institutional, systemic, or dynamics that look at the whole system of an entity, the four levels, we all are complicit in perpetuating white supremacy culture. And we're all accountable. Now, for those who have the power to make some shifts and have had some, have inherited a colonial lineage or a dehumanizing lineage, you're accountable to rehumanize your ancestors. So this isn't about like I'm trying to make you wrong or the bad person, or I'm trying to find every racist thing that I can say about you in possibility. No, I'm saying I have to do my work as a person that's been in a community that's been oppressed, and you have to do your work in a community that's historically had power to shift the system. And so now we're in the middle of it, and let's have that dialogue. This isn't a dialogue to find fault in you as an
Yeah.
individual. This is a dialogue to, I think, elevate a conversation that says, no, most people, I'm not saying everybody, but most people are not okay with the dehumanization of anyone. But if you don't recognize it and aren't willing to have a conversation and believe people when they tell you they've been dehumanized or had racist things happen to them, then you're perpetuating it. And so how do you reframe that, get away from the defensive posture and say, hey, you know what? I'm blind to some of this. Let's have the discussion,
Yes.
the dialogue, so that we can transcend it rather than spend all of our time in this vicious cycle of finding who's right and wrong. I mean, there's enough, I like to be right. Don't get me wrong. You know what I mean? but
and I bet you always are right.
Don't tell my wife that.
No,
but
not watching.
She probably is. But the the reality is that's not going to get us anywhere. So this tussle of right and wrongness that I often see, it's not where we need to be. It needs to get to who's accountable. We're all accountable. How do we do it? Who understands it? And how can we move forward together?
Yeah. But touching on the accountability, I think there was a reframing discussion to be had, though.
Yeah.
Look, I'm gonna maybe just say, look, I think every October in this country it's Black History Month, and every child will go through the process of learning about Rosa Parks and what a gift she is to the world, to Black people, in terms of refusing to stand at segregated buses. It's always baffled me is that we look at this. The idea, Rosa Parks lost her job. She had to move to Detroit. She had to move to a faraway city she could possibly. She lost equity, income. She did the emotional labor. We are saying that we are accountable. We all have accountability, of course, but the emotional labor, which is exhausting for physically, mentally, socially, and financially, has to be understood. But when it is understood, if it's ever understood, it's understood retrospectively. So Muhammad Ali is celebrated by the very same people who are condemning Colin Kaepernick. Why? Because it's an absurdity. It's a lack of recognition of, look, hey, you would have hated Muhammad Ali then, if you were there then, because you clearly hate Colin, and you're clearly prepared to boo at football stadiums in the UK. You are that guy, so recognize you're that guy. But what we also have to do is take a deep breath and say, look, how do we recognize that Rosa Parks, for example, gave a gift to white people in America? She gave a gift to the segregated people of white Americans to say, you are unwell. You are unwell, deeply unwell when you are living in a segregated state. You are physically not well to yourselves. You cannot be well to your children. So when we are to look at Rosa Parks, we need to move away from the idea of this paternalistic relationship with race, to say she was a gift to Black people, to recognize she was a gift to everybody, a different gift. But this emotional labor is a gift to you in power, and you to recognize that your power is making you socially unwell. Fix it, be part of it.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you. And there is a real sense of disturbance for me around the absurdity of, the spectrum in which this conversation exists. So when we talk about shared accountability, I absolutely agree. And I would say that people of in white society need to take more of the responsibility, so I don't think it's equally shared in terms of accountability across the piece. And I was kind of minded when you were talking. There's a couple of things that came to mind, which is how we, as white passing or white folks, take accountability and behave like allies, true, authentic allies with integrity. And there's something about that relationship with our Black and brown brothers and sisters who are, in that space. And I'll never forget a very dear friend who's, been doing this work for a very, very long time. He's also now on my board of trustees, and we've worked a lot together. And he won't mind me saying this because I've shared this story many times, but when I was asking him to think about, you know, we needed to have a really strong position statement on racism. And this was about 4 years ago on a project we were working on. And I was on ranting and I was saying it's not good enough to not use, because actually we've gone through a period of time not even saying racism. You know, we stepped back from that language. It's not good enough to not say that word, because that's what it is. This is what we're talking about. Let's not kind of sanitize it to make it palatable for everybody. And he turned to me and he said, you know, Sarah, it's easy for you to say. And that was a profound moment of realization for me, that the emotional labor for him as a person of color carrying this for such a long time far outweighed my own experience of the emotional labor, or the, you know, the fear of what saying this would what impact it would have on me. And we're not talking about 20 years ago. This is a recent, you know, conversation. And so I guess I kind of feel like, and it's the same with the FA or the football stuff and the cricket stuff that we've heard. I don't know, Amri, if you've seen the news here about the cricketers and who've posted racist comments as 18-year-olds, and a real kind of divisive narrative around, well, are they accountable and should be punished, or should we just accept that they were young, naive, and, you know, were learning? Now, I really struggle with that, because I wouldn't like the things that I did as an 18-year-old hold me accountable for the rest of my life, because, you know, there was a lot of alcohol involved. But I didn't post racist comments on social media. I didn't say racist things to my friends at 18 years old. You know, I was being accountable as an adult. And I agree, I appreciate we're not all in the same space as 18, 19-year-olds. But holding them to account, and it's just to your point, Amri, about, you know, we don't want to make this about good and bad people, or, you know, punish. But how do we hold people to account when either they don't want to be held to account, or the system around them doesn't want to hold them to account either? And I guess I'm always struck by that.
Yeah, you know, Sarah, if you do racist shit and the requirements of your organization are not to do racist shit, you have to be punished. So don't get me wrong, right?
Okay.
So if you're a cricketer and you have a responsibility to your squad, to your side, whatever it might be, and you say something like that in public, then you have to be accountable for it. That's just, I'm sorry, that's just a requirement. So that's not about your preference. That's not about your free speech. That's not about what's convenient to you and how you feel good and how your blokes are like, yeah, this is cool. No, that's wrong. You can't do it. You should get in trouble. You either are suspended for a year or indefinitely. It's one of those types of things, right? So don't get me wrong. This is not making excuses for anybody.
I'm going to come here with another question, if I may, because it's a good time to do it, actually.
Okay.
Off the back of this is, and all those listening, you know, on Facebook, do comment as well and see what, you know, and like what you need to like, but also be real with what we're talking about, really, and how it responds to you. So, firstly, I want to ask a question on that. The cricketers are a good example, but look, you know, without, you know, and what I enjoy about you two, particularly, and having gotten to know you, is that we move beyond sort of HR speak, you know, and so this question is really about that. Is in the sort of diversity and inclusion world, you know, we have discussions around, you know, racism in one corner, you know, because it's like, hey, it's we've got to be seen to do this, and we got, you know, disability over here, you know, and we got neurodiversity at best there, and mental health here, you know, and so woe betide you if you're a Black woman dealing with mental health and disablement, you know, because you might not have your party, you know, and so this inability to look at the intersectionality of this, to look means that we are not looking at the impact of these differences. If we're not intersectional, then I'm not sure we're relevant. And I have a question, I guess, or a challenge I'm just asking you is, why do you think that we do this? Why is it that we have, if you agree, that we have these siloed approaches in the work sector particularly? And what are the implications for that?
I mean, structure creates behavior. And historically, everything that we've been doing in corporate D&I has been about the segment. It hasn't been about the person. And so the segment says you have disablement or you're disabled. It says you're Black. So it's single identity conversations about things that should be done for this single identity, as if that's all we are, is that identity that's either visible or that we've disclosed. And so it's structured that way. The conversation about intersectionality has been around now for 30 years, but what we've done with it has, we've either politicized it instead of understanding what the kind of real foundation of it was when Kimberly Crenshaw brought it forward, and then how we actually begin to move into understanding it as multidimensionality, because intersectionality and multidimensionality are different, but we use them very much interchangeably, which I don't think is altogether bad. But to understand the dynamics that Crenshaw would put forth and what we have for looking at people as multidimensional beings is a different one. So I think we've structured it like that. Companies are still carrying it like that. It's very hard to measure things when you kind of lump them all together, so that a lot of companies don't understand how to do that. And I think our movements moving forward need to be about understanding how those dimensions actually intersect and what we need to do to address that as a whole human beings, rather than as these fragmented, incomplete labels that we're giving one another. And so I don't know, I don't have an answer to it, but I think it needs to be addressed and at least brought to the fore where organizations can understand that and start thinking about that in a particular way. There's one way that I think it could be done, and it also leads to the requirements for an organization to deal with racism in all its forms, is you need people to be interacting with each other that aren't from homogenous groups. I mean, I can tell you in organizations, ERGs are fantastic, but when there's single identity and there's nobody from any other community coming in to interact with those communities, Black ERGs are probably busier than they've ever been. A lot of them are probably so exhausted. I've met some people that, oh my God, I don't tell you how many anti-racism conversations I've had. I'm so busy and I'm not getting paid for it. That's oppressive in and of itself. So if you have more non-Black people in a Black ERG, they experience how to be not the other or be the other. And they have to get into having a conversation about some of these dynamics where they can understand people's lived experiences in a way that they can't if they don't have their ongoing interactions. They don't develop the maturity in one or two conversations. It has to be an ongoing dialogue. Yes. And so you can say that about any group, but that's where I think we've missed the mark in companies, is we've segmented and we've segmented and we segmented instead of connected.
Yeah, I mean, in a similar way, like for DNA is known for working with around disablement, and people. But I say, look, there are, challenging, thinking ahead, there are no, it's controversial, but I'll say, there are no people with disabilities. There are just people. They will come with different support needs and different strengths and different wonders. What we have got to figure out is, how are we welcoming people? What is it that we do to do that? The challenge is, I'm not here to not talk about disablement, but being Black and working in a racist office is a disabling situation. Mentally, if your career is hampered by the skin color, it doesn't mean being Black is a disability, but you can't say emotionally it's not disabling.
But we also know that racism poses an absolute threat to your physical and mental health. So it's kind of, I think that point around, because siloed thinking, it just serves to maintain the institutional structures that we have. And so it allows us to maintain a way of operating that we felt very comfortable with. And actually, if we started to integrate the person, imagine what would happen. It means all sorts of things would need to change, power structures, the routes through, exactly like you say, we talk about no wrong door in care. And of course, all the doors are wrong, all of the, so it kind of, I always smile when I hear that, because I just think, oh, well, actually, there should only be one door, for us all. And then once you walk through the door, you are welcomed, and whatever needs you have, we will deal with it, because we have the capacity and the desire to help you, the true desire to help you. But if we, and again, it's really hard not to go to that very dark place of thinking, why we don't change those siloed thinking, because even within an integrated care system, where, you know, the ultimate aim or the stated aim is to see the individual, to provide them with the care that they need at the earliest opportunity. But actually what we still have is a system whereby that the funding structures or the political pathways around that fundamentally don't align with that outcome. And so the issue of intersectionality literally cannot be contemplated within an integrated care system. It's
and absolutely, these are absolutely right. Sometimes I think that when we're thinking about the diversity inclusion world, we're still weighing ourselves far too much around corporate compliance. And compliance, I think, I'd say compliance means you don't get sued, but it doesn't mean you include, and to truly include, you've got to move at a speed that says people have got a good reason to trust and a good reason not to trust, the speed of trust, or what that looks like. But I still think the challenges we've still got is, look, if we're here to talk about Pride Month, and as we should be, and we can, but we're also not, if we still have folks who are afraid to use what pronouns to use to talk about their weekend with their partners, then that is a mental health discussion. It is a disabling discussion, but we have to contextualize that throughout the year rather than just on a particular month. And that's the challenge that everyone's got to face up to, especially those.
That's a powerful framing, Atif, and I don't think very many people have had that framing of disablement. It was one of the things that really jumped out at me when we had our first conversation right before Corona happened in London. This notion that there's things that organizations do that create dynamics of disablement, and they impact people of all kind of intersections or combinations. And they disproportionately affect those who have been historically oppressed more. And so if that framing in and of itself, I think, moves us beyond thinking about everything in single issue conversations or focusing on the month. I can't tell you, I celebrate everybody every month. I celebrate Black history all year round. When I try to read books across the spectrum of folks so that I can understand that community better, even if I'm not part of it directly. I want to be in solidarity with folks. And so sometimes these months will help that. Sometimes they'll make it an excuse that's what we do for now, versus this is really the beginning of us understanding this deeper, and what are we going to do to maintain it. So I think, we have to be vigilant in our organizations, institutions, and those that we work with to say, hey, you might want to take a little closer look at this and talk to your folks about how their particular combinations of mixtures are impacting them and how they're helping, and where disablement is happening in the organization that the organization fundamentally just doesn't get. So that means you have to be constantly listening to your people about that and be willing to have the conversation and be influenced by them.
It's interesting just on that point, and it's as you were speaking, I was thinking some people might translate intersectionality into all lives matter. And I think there is a point at which, isn't there, where one of the challenges we've had over the last year is by saying Black Lives Matter, we're not saying that all lives don't matter. We're saying that actually until Black Lives Matter, all lives don't matter. So that's basically what we're saying. But it's about how this, I was thinking easily how all of these things are we can manipulate to serve our particular position, and how we must be vigilant about that, and so sophisticated. And Amri is incredibly sophisticated in your ability to convey that. And I think if we could just clip that and just replay it every now and again, that would be helpful.
I'm not always sophisticated. Sometimes I'm a bit pissed.
Yeah, so I love that.
But I don't let that out on TV too much. But the thing that I think is important, Sarah, is I'm a bit tired of trying to explain to people things like all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. I'm not at that point. I'm like, look, you don't have to agree with it, but understand it at its root. And if you don't want to, okay. I'm not going to spend a lot of energy. And that, I know when we see racist tropes on the internet and on social media, I'm like, how much energy do we need to continue to spend to talk about them, particularly when they occur to me sometimes as intentional, like baiting. And so how do you, I just had a conversation with a real big influencer on this on LinkedIn. I'm like, look, I want to call out racists, and I want to create requirements in their organizations that when they do it, I don't have to call them out. They get reprimanded with something that's very real, because me calling them out on social media actually might amplify them and have them move me into a conversation that I don't want to have. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't call people out. I'm just saying we need to be really going into institutions and saying, are you okay with your folks representing you with this crap? And if you are, then we have to take some action about how we engage with your organization. And that's when we get into the systemic and structural stuff that I think for me is the most important part of the work of anti-racism. You know, the interpersonal is important, but the systems and structures conversation is the one that I think we could be more strategic about and more deliberate about, and it has a bigger impact on it has a bigger pain point for institutions as well. So
I want to just make, this is fantastic. I want to, I mean, part of me, I'm just going to move us on to the last question, but I just want to share something. So, you know, part of me sort of, I fluctuate on this issue. You know, part of me says, look, you know, as I touched on earlier, when Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, then there was a point where people say all lives matters and a reaction to that. But here we are, you know, we're 6 years on. Really, I mean, you guys know, you know, if you're coming out all like, you know, you don't not know, you know, right? So that so I can sit there and say, look, you know, look, when I say, look, save the whales, I didn't say and fuck the dolphins, right?
No, we love the dolphin. We need the sharks.
We never said that. That was never said. All we said was there's an urgency, there is an emergency, and these whales are dying. So can we talk about these whales, right? And so that's okay. But I think here I am 6 years later thinking, I don't know if that's even worth any space. And I hear it in Amri's voice, I hear it in Sarah's.
Yes.
I'm down to the last few minutes. So I just want to ask, down to the really last, this is what I would say to all of those who are enjoying this. We're going to do this more. I think I really felt this as I, you know, this was the first one, but we're going to do more. But I want to ask a question to both of you, just in the short 5 minutes that we have. Of what keeps you hopeful? You know, I want to ask Sarah first, if I may.
Okay, well, it's my kids and your kids. So, you know, when you tell me stories about your kids talking about climate change, and, you know, my children are 8 and 11. And when I hear my daughter, I brought home a sign from Alcatraz that said, you will receive, I thought it was funny at the time, right? You will receive food and shelter. Everything else is a privilege, right? And I thought this was a message to my children to convey. And my daughter at the time, she was only 8, she's 11 now. She said to me at the time, but mummy, you know very well, and this was the language she used, mummy, you know very well that all of that is a privilege. So that's just nonsense. And I was so proud of her, because I thought, oh my God, she's just got it. And I think when you instill, it's never too early to instill social justice qualities in your children. And my children have been talking about this since they could talk, and so they give me hope every day that, you know, this generation's going to do something big.
Yeah, absolutely. Bless. Yeah, really, I'm desperate to share something there, but I think I'll wait till I've asked Amri similar sort of thing. But Amri,
my hope,
keeps you hopeful?
My hope always lies in that light is possible. We've had so much heat, and we've needed heat, but I think right now I see light, and I see the possibility of our kids and people in our communities who are committed to this beyond their own self-interest, for light. And so I hear that every day. I talk to people like you. I get a chance to engage with a lot of my clients who are taking this really seriously. It's becoming a part of who they are. So that's the light. And I think that's the space we need to shine it. Sometimes we need to turn up the light and make it a little bit uncomfortable. And, you know, you need a little bit of sweat from the light. Yes. But the light is possible. And I see a lot of people projecting it and wanting to send it into the future for our kids. So that's where I am, and that's where I stay hopeful.
I think Very much. It's the same. It's the faith in the future. And I think we're not here. I mean, we're talking about, as I said right in the beginning, some serious discussions and meaningful ones. They're not easy ones, but we're here, not here to sell despair, you know. And I'm really conscious and grateful to the two of you for not giving into that in your lives, even when it's been a struggle. I want to say that. And also, you know, I guess the same thing. Look, I saw a sign in Brighton. Okay, you can see Brighton, but it was actually a group of young white women holding a sign, and the sign said on it, I won't forget it, it said, it was Black Lives Matters, but it said, "I don't know what it is to feel what you feel, but here I stand." You know? And that, I thought, just the acknowledgement to say, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to fill in the gaps or reach for defensive postures, as Amiri said, or come up with some, I don't know, but I stand. You know, that gave me something. And I think every day, my son and my daughter always, I can't help but say that, but I ask them each day, you know, what does love look like today? What does it look like today? It's not just words, it's actions, it's things. It's somebody, a stranger, just stopping to, my son cut his knee and a stranger came out with a plaster. That's what love looks like, you know? And he can say that. And I think that gives me strength to say, yeah, this is all good, you know? It's not easy. It perhaps never will be, but it's all good, and it can be.
That's a new question in my house.
What is that?
Yeah, I've added it in at least 2 languages.
Thank you. Listen, I want to just finish there. I know we have gone over by 1 minute, but I don't really want to say, because it's not really a goodbye. I want to say, look, that we're going to do this more, I think, you know, depending on, listen, hey, we haven't seen the Facebook comments, right? So there's loads of trash on there. Maybe we won't. You know, maybe you're all hating on us, right? But
you just never know.
Yeah, I'll never know. No, we'll have a look at that, and you know, and I want to then hand it over to, I think, Ellie, who's going to say goodbye to everybody. And Ellie, if you are, I think you are there, so I think you want to come in and say goodbye to everyone. And for me, I want to stop and say just again, thank you, Amiri, thank you, Sarah, for being so real, and this, for making this so meaningful for everybody. You know, especially.
Thank you for being an extraordinary man.
That's sweet.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much, and thank you for the amazing comments throughout as well. Loads of wonderful questions which we will come back to in a future session, and loads of wonderful comments as well. So thank you all for your contributions, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, Ellie.
Take care. Much love, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.